Welcome back to Trail and Ultra Running Training. If you enjoy this, please share it with someone. That's all I really ask. Just trying to provide some helpful, free information on running to people because there's a lot of information out there and just trying to help people weed through what may be useful if your brain works kind of like mine. So today, let's talk about running form. And first off, I want to say that running is not the same as walking. I've heard this stated by multiple people, heard both directions of this, and the way you walk is not necessarily indicative of the way you run. It could be a good indicator. It could be a good light on the dashboard, but it's not necessarily going to show us how you run. So if we're going to look at your running, then we should probably take a video of ourselves running or have someone else look at you run from a few different directions and see what we need to fix. All right. So let's look at the basics of running form, the things that we need to have in order to have good running form. Let's call it prerequisites, right? One of them is pelvic control. Another one is going to be hip extension, being able to push your leg behind you using your glutes. Another is going to be some form, like some degree of ankle flexion, and to a lesser degree, shoulder mobility and some like upper back strength. Those two are intertwined and they're not really separable. If we don't have those things, then we are not going to really be able to hit a lot of the cues that we hear when it comes to running form. Now, again, the way you move throughout your day-to-day life may just not be a great indicator of your running form. Could be a warning light, not a guarantee. For example, if you spend all day in heels, be them stilettos or work boots, like I used to when I was a mechanic, then you're probably going to have some level of decent anterior pelvic tilt. Like if I have my pelvis and it is tilted forward like that, then that is not going to be super helpful with running. But if you're wearing high heels or like elevated work boots, then it is very likely you are going to have some anterior pelvic tilt throughout your day. Doesn't mean you're going to run with that pelvic tilt. It is probable if we don't do a lot of activity, but it is not guaranteed. So we need to look at ourselves while running to see if we have that pelvic control. So if you don't have that pelvic control, if we're not able to stack your pelvis flat and have the rib cage directly stacked over the pelvis, then we're going to need to improve that, right? Now, this is not the same as a flat spine. Your spine is supposed to curve. It goes from your head, curves in at your neck, curves out at your upper back, curves in at your lower back, and then tucks under in your sacrum into your pelvis. We are not trying to get rid of that natural lumbar curve. And some people have a bigger curve than others. Mine is fairly moderate. So if you see like videos of me moving, that is a fairly moderate curve. I know people who are like a flatter stacked spine. I know people who are way more swayed, but we want to be able to have that pelvic control where your pelvis is stacked directly underneath your rib cage. And if we can't do that, we need to gain access to that position, right? So ways to improve pelvic mobility. A good starter would be something like a cat cow where you lay or like come down onto all fours, your hands and your knees, and then we go into that big arched back cat position and that big tucked cow position or cat camel or whatever we call it, right? So that cat position, what I will often see with people who don't have pelvic control is they push really high into their upper back. They get that big rounding in their upper back, their thoracic spine, but their pelvis keeps that big, like forward tilt. They still have this sway in their low back. We need to do this with the intention of tucking the pelvis underneath you so that we can create the movement that we're looking to create. Once we have that, or while we create that, I like to do these things in conjunction with people where we're trying to regain pelvic control, would be something called a TVA vacuum. Your transverse abdominis is a deep muscle in your abdomen. I went over this a bit during the like how to properly train your core episode. And you just put your fingers on your abs, top to bottom, and pull back away from them. And if you do it right, your breathing is going to change, like mine did right there, because we were using the deep muscle of our abdomen and we were compressing everything in and up, which pushes your diaphragm up, which means less space for your lungs to expand. Now we have to understand that these fibers run laterally, they run sideways. It's not a top to bottom thing. Your rectus abdominis, otherwise known as your six pack or your eight pack, that is a top to bottom fiber. That is why, like when we crunch, we can get sensation through the entire thing, unless we lack pelvic control. But for this, like you actually could just pull the fibers of your TVA at the top of your abdomen and not even really touch the bottom. So I like to put my fingers right above my pant line and pull away from them, because that is where I struggle to create that connection. And if I'm pulling away from my fingers, trying to pull my entire front of my body, my abdomen, back to my spine, then we should feel this pull. Now, these fibers do connect all the way at your low back. So if you pull them hard enough and pull solidly enough, you might feel something in your low back. It should feel like work. It shouldn't feel like pain. Now, if we can train your TVA to be stable and regain control of pelvis, then we can add more load to this through something like a reverse crunch, where you lay on a bench and hold the bench overhead, or lay on the ground and hold something steady overhead, roll your spine up off the ground and then place it back down. Or for like stronger people and people with better grip strength, we can do like hanging knee raises and hanging leg raises. But again, we're really focusing on that pelvic tilt and that spinal flexion, rather than just picking up our legs, or else you're just going to use your rectus femoris and the muscle in your quad and your psoas and hip flexors, and you're not going to do anything really for your abs more than you would from a plank. So we really want to focus on this pelvic control if we're trying to regain this access, right? Once we have that, then we can really worry about our next thing, which would be hip extension. If you don't have decent pelvic control, then if you don't have access to hip extension, we can do this at the same time, but we can't really use our glutes super well if we can't stack our pelvis. We'll get back to that in a second. A good test for hip extension is what we would call a Thomas test. This is really easy to look up, but you lay on a bench or a box or something that is slightly higher than your knee height. If I do this in the gym, I will usually put somebody on like a 21 or 24-inch box, just because it's easy to grab and it's pretty much guaranteed that it's going to be higher than their knees. And then when you have them sit, or you sit on the edge of the box with like half of your butt hanging off the box, lay back, hug one knee, and let the other leg drop. And this is where we want like half the butt hanging off and half on, because you want the low back, like by hugging that knee, you are forcing that low back to press into the box. And when you let the other leg hang, ideally the knee will hang a little bit below your hip and your heel will hang directly below that knee. So the knee is going to come out at a slightly downward angle, and then the ankle is going to come directly down from your knee. If you're a little off on the ankle, like my foot hangs probably like 15 degrees in front of my knee, because my quads are a little tight, but not that big of a deal. But what causes real issues is when your knee is significantly higher than your hip. That means your hip flexors are so tight that you're not really going to be able to push back with your glutes. Because if we can't gain access to a range of motion in a passive instance like this, it is really hard to push yourself into it, into some form of like active movement, right? So, pardon me. So we need to be able to create this extension in order to use our glutes when we run, right? Now, what leads to bad hip extension is usually going to be like tight quads or tight hip flexors or tight whatever, right? Now, something like a couch stretch from Kelly Starrett is a pretty aggressive way to stretch this, but you like get down on all fours, you place a shin flush against a wall, and then you come up, step your other foot out in front, and squeeze forward with your glutes. If you search couch stretch, you can see it either on my YouTube channel or plenty of others. Again, that is a really aggressive version of that. If your knee is farther off the wall, this will become easier. We can also do this standing by like placing your ankle on a couch and then like the back of a couch instead of the front and tucking underneath. But we want to stretch that quad at the hip flexor if we don't have access to it. Now, once we have that hip extension, we can use our glutes. And great exercises to learn to use your glutes would be like a 45-degree glute extension, where you get one of those 45-degree back things. And instead of coming up with your low back, you keep your back rounded, brace your torso, and squeeze your butt really hard. And then your butt is going to pull you up and let you come back down. Lunges can also be a really good corrective mechanism as long as you step out far enough, because they will force you, especially walking lunges, because they will push you into some level of that hip extension as long as you can brace your pelvis. This is why the pelvis was first, because if we don't have that pelvis, then we're just going to end up in that big swayed back and you're not going to get hip extension anyway. And then we can also do something like a higher rep hip thrust. And that can also help us to find our glutes, right? And if we're struggling to use our glutes when we run, any of these things like 15 reps of a hip thrust or something like that can be super useful as part of our warm-up before we head out the door, just to kind of remind those muscles that they exist, right? Now, once we have these things, we also want some ankle flexion. And what you really want is if you like put your hands on a wall and step back and drive your knee over your toes until you tap the wall, but the heel like just stays down on the floor, you want to be able to get your knee about a palm's width, including the thumb, past the ends of your toes. That is a ballpark. Everybody's going to be a little different based on like length of tibia, etc. But you want to be able to get your knee about a palm's width past your toes. And if we can't do that, even if you have good pelvic control and great hip extension, when you drive back, you are not going to be able to really use your glutes, because all you're going to do is drive through your calves, because your heel's already off the floor before you have access to your glutes. Now, when we go through this running, how to fix that would probably be pertinent. So stretch your calf, stretch your Achilles. We can step up on a step, put the ball of your foot on a step and just let your heels drop. You can do this single-legged or both leg if you have problems in both leg. You can also do some like ankle or foot mobility stuff. I like an elevated combat stretch for this. You can look up what that is. It's pretty easy to search as well. Ankle inversion and eversion. So if we have our foot flat on the ground and we like tilt it side to side while trying to keep our shin straight, that is what we call inversion and eversion. As the inside of your foot comes up, inversion, inside inversion. And then as the outside of your foot comes up, that'd be eversion. And if we do a few of those before we go through an ankle stretch, like a calf stretch, then we'll create a little more space in the foot and give the tibia a little more room to move. Finally, I mentioned shoulder mobility or upper back strength, or whatever, because they're not really separate. If our shoulders are always round forward, probably have some like constantly on, concentric, tight, whatever you want to call it, pectoral muscles. And so we want to create space up here in the chest and like front of our deltoid, and then some strength in the upper back. So space, we could do a like dumbbell bench press, or we can do an elevated, hands elevated push-up, but really focusing on that deep stretch at the bottom and pinching your shoulder blades back together. You can also use a band to come up and over through some like pullovers, whatever it is that gets some space here. And then we can do something like a row, be it a dumbbell row or a T-bar row or a Meadows row or like a hammer strength row with a wide grip, any kind of row that keeps your elbows out a little bit and allows you to pinch your shoulder blades together is going to build that upper back, and you will feel the engagement between your shoulder blades. And then once we have all this, we have positioning to run well. This is not to say that you shouldn't be running while you go through this. It is just, this is the like prerequisite mobility stuff. If we're really going to get nitpicky about run positioning or run form, then we need to have access to some of this, and we can build a lot of this while we run. And we should be building a lot of this while we run, because it is going to help us run better, more efficiently, more effectively, whatever words you want to say. So once we have access to all this, we're going to make our pelvis flat. We're going to stack the rib cage over the pelvis. You're going to lean forward at the ankles, not the hips. And then you're basically going to want to fall over. And then running is just catching yourself from falling. And you load your body weight over your foot. When your foot is directly into your body, you're going to drive back with your glutes by creating that hip extension. I like, can't remember his name, Matt Meinard, push with the tush idea. In order to push with the tush, you need to stack the pelvis and create glute hip extension, but push back with the tush. And then we want to keep the knee bent a little bit for endurance running. You don't want to fully flex the ankle and fully flex the knee, because for anything over probably an 800-meter race, that is more of a sprint position, what we call triple extension, where you extend the hip, extend the knee, extend the ankle. That is a great sprinting form. And if you look up a lot of running form online, that is the picture you're going to see. But we actually want a small bend in the knee the entire time for endurance running. And then keep your heart up, and that's good, right? So stack rib cage over pelvis, lean forward at the ankles, catch yourself from falling, load foot under body, drive back with the glutes, and keep your knee bent a little bit. Once we have, and then there's this conversation about arm swing, which we should mention here for completion's sake. I don't talk too much about arm swing. Don't try and swing them aggressively forward from your body. We want the elbows to be going in this back and forth motion, right? But arm swing tends to be a manifestation of shoulder position, right? If my shoulder is always forward and very anteriorly rotated, I have no choice but to swing across my body. If my shoulder's kind of back, my heart's up, and I can keep everything stacked, then I will naturally swing more forward, like everyone talks about. I don't really talk about arm swing, because if we fix the other stuff in the upper body, then the arm swing fixes itself further. They did a study where they like tied people's hands or duct tape or something to the top of their heads, and they only saw like a few percent decrease in performance. So if we're swinging here, like slightly across the body versus directly in front, just probably doesn't matter all that much. And it's not where I would have anybody who isn't like either really struggling with shoulder stuff or getting paid very large amounts of money to run, put any amount of stress whatsoever. If you fix the shoulder position, we should fix the arm swing. So those are our basics on running. One of the things that I think this is really just a whatever effect it is when you see a blue car, then you see 1,000 blue cars. Since it's like, or once you buy a blue car, you see 1,000 blue cars. Same idea here. I've been noticing just pelvic tilt everywhere. And we have this large conversation about like using the glutes and keeping everything upright and blah, blah, blah. And all of those things are super useful. But if we don't get the pelvis flat first and get the rib cage stacked over the pelvis, everything else doesn't really work very well. And because we all sit in desk positions and like wear shoes with big lifts and everything throughout our day, we tend to have pretty poor pelvic position. Again, your daily movement is not 100% a sign of how you are going to run, but it is a pretty good light on the dashboard. So if we can't create that pelvic tilt and maintain it for as long as we're going to run, we're going to struggle to use our glutes, which means we're going to end up tilted forward, and we're probably going to end up with a bunch of low back pain. So fix the pelvis first. Everything else will kind of follow, and hope that was helpful. I realized like there were some tactics in here. It's largely principles, because if we actually understand how the body moves, then we can use the principles to build the tactics that will be relevant to you as a human, because that's what really matters. Anyway, I hope this was helpful, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.